I was the loyal soldier. I fought across your wars. I fought your wars across 100 worlds. My brothers bled and died to protect the fragile borders of your empire. But your Imperium, in its ignorance, betrayed me. You called me traitor, renegade, heretic. Well, so be it. I have carved out my own empire, where the strong can prosper, unshackled from the petty fears of tired old men. I am Huron Blackheart, the Tyrant of Badab, Lord of the Maelstrom. The Maelstrom is not a frontier, it is a wound. A vast permanent warp storm tearing at the heart of the Imperium, spewing pirates, demons, and renegades into real space. It cannot be conquered, it cannot be sealed, it can only be watched. And for centuries, the Imperium chose not to look too closely. Instead, it delegated. To guard the Maelstrom Zone, the Imperium empowered a cluster of Space Marine chapters known as the Maelstrom Warders. Among them stood the Astral Claws, ambitious, aggressive, and increasingly indispensable. At their head was Luft Huron. Huron was not born a rebel, he was appointed. Granted authority over multiple star systems, responsibility for suppressing piracy, and the unenviable task of holding the line of the Imperium itself. Granted authority over multiple star systems, responsibility for suppressing piracy, and the unenviable task of holding a line the Imperium itself refused to enforce. Unlike many chapter masters, Huron was not content with symbolic defense. He acted. Under his leadership, the Astral Claws expanded their recruitment, strengthened their fleets, and brought stability to the regions long abandoned to chaos and lawlessness. Worlds that had once paid tithes irregularly, or not at all, were brought back into compliance. For a time, the system worked. Too well. The Imperium does not reward initiative easily. Success attracts scrutiny. As Huron's domain grew more stable and more autonomous, questions followed. Why were the Astral Claws so well supplied? Why were the tithes delayed? Why did one chapter wield so much influence? From Huron's perspective, the answers were simple. The Maelstrom demanded strength. Strength demanded resources, and the Imperium was slow to provide both. Repeatedly, Huron petitioned Terra for aid. More ships, more manpower, more authority to respond rapidly to threats emerging from the warp storm. Some of these requests were delayed. Others were denied outright. A few were met with silence. This was not malice. It was bureaucracy. But bureaucracy kills just as surely as treachery. As pressure mounted along the Maelstrom Zone, Huron made a choice that would define his fate. Rather than allow Imperial inefficiency to cost lives and territory, he began to act independently. He withheld tithes. He redirected resources. He ruled his sector as if Terra were too distant to matter. In his mind, he was not rebelling. He was compensating. This is the critical truth of Huron Blackheart. Before he was a traitor, before he was damned, he believed himself loyal. More loyal than those that refuse to act. And in the Imperium of man, that belief is often the most dangerous weapon of all. If the Imperium excels at one thing, it is war. What it struggles with is governance. The Maelstrom Zone was not merely dangerous because of pirates or warp incursions. It was dangerous because it existed in the margins, too unstable to be controlled directly, too valuable to abandon. For decades, Imperial authority in the region was reactive, fragmented, and slow. This was the environment Luft Huron inherited. Unlike many chapter masters, Huron did not see his role as purely martial. He understood that constant war without stability only bred more war. If the Maelstrom Zone was ever to be held, it would require more than punitive raids and symbolic patrols. It would require infrastructure. Under Huron's leadership, the Astral Claws began to change how they operated. Recruitment increased, not recklessly, but systematically. Fleet assets were expanded and maintained at a level uncommon for a single chapter. Supply chains were secured, defended, and in some cases, quietly redirected. These actions were not unprecedented. They were simply more effective than the Imperium was comfortable with. Worlds along the Maelstrom's edge saw tangible improvements. Pirate activity declined. Trade routes stabilized. Tithes became more reliable. For planetary governors and civilian populations, Huron's rule brought something rare in the Imperium: predictability. This success drew attention, not all of it favourable. From Terra's perspective, the Maelstrom Zone was being handled, but not in the way the Imperium preferred. Authority was consolidating, decisions were being made locally. A single Space Marine chapter was exercising influence, usually reserved for much larger Imperial structures, and at the centre of it all was Huron. To understand why this mattered, one must understand how the Imperium views power. Authority is tolerated when it is distant, inefficient, and divided. Centralisation is viewed with suspicion, especially when it is effective. Huron's greatest mistake was not defiance, it was competence. As his reputation grew, so did Imperial scrutiny. Administrative officials began auditing tithes more closely. Requests for additional resources were met with hesitation. Some were approved slowly, others were delayed indefinitely. A few were quietly denied. From Terra, this was caution. From the Maelstrom Zone, it was negligence. Huron's response was pragmatic. If resources were slow to arrive, he would secure them himself. If ties were needed to maintain fleets and garrisons, they would be withheld until stability could be guaranteed. These decisions were not framed as rebellion, but as necessity. And for a time, the results justified the methods. The Maelstrom did not grow quieter. It never does. But it became more manageable. Threats were contained before escalating. Renegade forces were crushed decisively. The Astral Claws became not just wardens, but administrators, enforcers, and architects of order. This was the height of Huron's power. It is important to pause here, because this is where many retellings simplify the story. Huron is often portrayed as already fallen by this stage, a tyrant in waiting, hoarding power for its own sake. The record does not support this. What it shows is a commander who believed that the Imperium's rigidity was incompatible with the survival on the frontier, that rules written for stable sectors could not apply to a region permanently bleeding from the warp. In Huron's mind, loyalty did not mean obedience, it meant results. And results in the Imperium are tolerated only so long as they do not challenge authority. By the time the Imperium began to truly react, the Maelstrom Zone was no longer a neglected frontier. It was a dominion shaped by one will, one strategy, and one chapter. That reality could not be ignored, nor could it be allowed to continue. The Imperium is not quick to anger. It is slow, procedural, and deliberate, until it is not. For years, tensions between Terra and the Maelstrom Zone simmered beneath layers of paperwork and delayed response. The Astral Claws continued to operate, the Maelstrom remained contained, and Luft Huron continued to believe that results would outweigh concern. They did not. From the perspective of the Administratum, irregularities were accumulating. Tithe discrepancies, fleet inventories that did not align with Codex expectations, recruitment numbers that exceeded what a single chapter was meant to sustain. Individually, none of these were unprecedented. Together, they suggested something the Imperium fears above all else: a Space Marine chapter acting independently of oversight. Audits intensified, messages from Terra shifted in tone, no longer cautious, but pointed. Requests for clarification replaced requests for cooperation. Where once there had been delay, there was now suspicion. For Huron, this shift was not merely insulting, it was dangerous. The Maelstrom did not pause for bureaucracy. Raids did not wait for the approval seals. Every delay translated directly into bloodshed along the frontier. From Huron's perspective, the Imperium was preparing to weaken the very defences keeping the region intact, and so he pushed back. Tithes were withheld more openly. Compliance became conditional. Imperial representatives found themselves delayed, redirected, or ignored entirely. Huron did not declare succession, nor did he renounce the Imperium. Instead, he challenged its assumptions. He argued, formally, repeatedly, that the Maelstrom Zone requires exceptional authority, that rigid adherence to distant regulation would undo years of hard-won stability, that judgment on the frontier could not be made by clerks who had never seen the warp storms firsthand. These arguments were not unprecedented. They were simply not welcome. To Terra, Huron's justifications sounded increasingly like excuses. Worse, they sounded persuasive. At this point, the conflict ceased to be about tithes. It became about precedent. Because if one chapter could do this successfully, others might follow. The response was escalation. Other Space Marine chapters were petitioned. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched, not to negotiate, but to observe and report. Official censors were prepared, their language carefully calibrated to stop just short of open accusation. Huron received these developments as confirmation of his fears. In his mind, Terra had already decided. The audits were not corrective, they were preparatory. He believed the Imperium was laying the groundwork to strip him of authority, dismantle the defence he had built, and reassert control regardless of consequence. At this stage, compromise was still possible, but trust was not. Huron's decisions hardened. Loyalty became conditional on survival. He drew closer to allied chapters within the Maelstrom Warders, and began treating Imperial directives not as obligations to be followed, but as guidance to be weighed. What had once been framed as compensation for Imperial failure now became defiance of Imperial authority, not declared in a single act, but accumulated through countless refusals, delays, and unilateral decisions, each one small, each one justifiable, together irreversible. From Terra's perspective, the line had been crossed. A Space Marine chapter had ceased to obey, and in the Imperium of man, disobedience, however rational, cannot be allowed to stand. The wheels of retribution began to turn. They turned slowly. They always do. But once in motion, they do not stop. Wars in the Imperium rarely begin with declarations. They begin with paperwork. By the time open conflict erupted in the Badab sector, the decision had already been made. Quietly, carefully, and far from the Maelstrom itself. From Terra's perspective, Luft Huron was no longer a difficult warden, he was a liability, and liabilities are removed. The first phase of the Badab War was not a battle, but a test. Loyalist Space Marine chapters were dispatched under the guise of arbitration and enforcement, tasked with compelling compliance rather than conquest. The hope, if it can be called that, was that Huron would submit once confronted with overwhelming authority. He did not. Instead, Huron fortified. The Astral Claws, along with chapters of the Maelstrom Warders, prepared for a conflict they believed had been forced upon them. Defensive networks were strengthened, void assets repositioned. Badab Primus, the Astral Claws fortress world, was transformed into a bastion. From Huron's perspective, this was not rebellion, it was survival. The Imperium, however, interpreted these actions as confirmation of guilt, and what might once have been resolved through sanction or restructuring now required force. The language of compliance gave way to the language of punishment, and so brother was sent to fight brother. The Badab War escalated rapidly, drawing in multiple Space Marine chapters on both sides. This was not a clean division between loyalists and traitors, but a fractured conflict, defined by obligation, interpretation, and circumstance. Some chapters fought to uphold Imperial law. Others believed the Imperium had overreached. There were no heroes, only consequences. Battles raged across the Badab sector in void engagements, planetary assaults, and grinding sieges. Worlds that had only recently known stability were reduced once more to war zones. Civilian populations suffered first and most severely, caught between forces that claimed to be acting in the Imperium's name. As the conflict dragged on, the Imperium escalated from enforcement to outright suppression. Supply lines were cut, reinforcements poured in. The strategic objective narrowed to a single outcome: the destruction of Huron's power base. The outcome centered on the Astral Claws fortress world, Badab Primus. The siege was brutal and methodical. Loyalist forces encircled the planet, isolating it from resupply and escape. Orbital bombardments stripped defences. Ground assaults followed, grinding down resistance through attrition rather than divisive strike. Huron fought throughout the campaign, not as a distant commander, but as a war leader. He coordinated defences, counterattacks, and evacuations, determined to preserve what he could of his forces. But the disparity in resources was insurmountable. One by one, Huron's allies fell away. Some chapters withdrew when the cost became too great, others were destroyed outright. The Maelstrom Warders fractured under pressure, their unity collapsing in the face of Imperial might. By the final stage of the siege, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Badab Primus fell. During the last desperate fighting, Huron was grievously wounded, his body shattered, burned and broken, amid the ruins of the fortress he had built. For the Imperium, this should have been the end. It was not. Huron was recovered by his remaining followers, and carried into the Maelstrom itself. Beyond the reach of Imperial retribution, the Badab War officially ended with an Imperial victory, but it was a victory paid for in Astartes' blood. The Imperium had crushed a rebellion, but it had also proven something else, that even Space Marines could be turned against one another, not by chaos, not by demons, but by the Imperium's own fear of losing control. The Badab War was recorded as a necessary purge. Those who survived remembered it differently. Huron should have died on Badab Primus. By every Imperial measure, he was already dead. His body ruined, his command shattered, his cause defeated. What remained of the Astral Claws fled not as an army, but as survivors, carrying their broken chapter master into the one place the Imperium could not pursue him, the Maelstrom. Within the warp storm, time loses meaning, reality fractures, survival itself becomes conditional. It was here, amid madness and ruin, that Luft Huron ceased to exist, and Blackheart was born. Huron's survival was neither miraculous nor clean. His body was rebuilt through extreme augmentation, crude, brutal, and incomplete. Warp exposure twisted flesh and spirit alike. Pain became constant, rage became focus. What remained of his humanity was held together by will alone. This was not ascension, it was endurance. Unlike many who flee into the Eye or the Maelstrom, Huron did not emerge as a zealot. He did not kneel before the ruinous powers, nor did he surrender himself fully to corruption. Chaos was not his master. It was a tool. In the void beyond Imperial reach, Huron gathered the remnants of his forces and began something new. The Astral Claws were no more. In their place rose the Red Corsairs, a vast fleet-based brotherhood of renegades, pirates, and traitor Astartes. They were not united by faith, they were united by grievance. Huron understands something the Imperium never had. Space Marines do not need belief to rebel, they need purpose. The Red Corsairs offered something what the Imperium could not: autonomy, plunder, and vengeance. Under Blackheart's command, they grew rapidly. Disgraced chapters, exiles, survivors of failed rebellions, warriors who had slipped through the cracks of Imperial authority, found refuge beneath his banner. Where the Imperium demanded obedience, Huron offered opportunity. Where chaos demanded devotion, Huron demanded results. The Red Corsairs became a terror along the Imperium's borders, striking shipping lanes, raiding worlds, and vanishing back into the Maelstrom before retaliation could follow. Each raid was more than piracy. It was proof. Proof that the Imperium's authority was not absolute. Proof that rebellion could endure without surrendering entirely to the warp. Yet chaos was never absent. With every bargain struck, every weapon reforged, every alliance made with darker powers, the line Huron walked grew thinner. Warp-tainted technologies sustained him. Demonic forces were employed when useful. The Maelstrom seeped into everything he commanded. Blackheart told himself he remained in control, that he was using chaos, not serving it. Whether that distinction still matters is unclear. What is clear is this: Huron Blackheart did not abandon the Imperium out of hatred alone. He abandoned it because he believed it had already abandoned its own purpose. In the Maelstrom, he did not find redemption. He found freedom, and freedom, in the galaxy of the 41st millennium, is often indistinguishable from damnation. History rarely remembers intentions. It remembers outcomes. By the time Huron Blackheart emerged from the Maelstrom, the Imperium no longer spoke of Luft Huron at all. Records named him renegade, pirate, traitor. The Badab War was closed, archived, and classified as a necessary purge. But the consequences did not end there. The Red Corsairs did not fade into obscurity like so many failed rebellions. They endured. They grew. Decades later, they remain one of the largest and most dangerous Chaos warbands in the galaxy. Not dangerous because of prophecy or divine favour, but because their existence answered a need the Imperium refused to acknowledge. Huron Blackheart is not Horus. He is not Abaddon. He does not seek to topple the Imperium in the name of the gods. His rebellion is smaller, and in some ways more unsettling. Huron represents a truth that the Imperium cannot confront, that its greatest threats do not always arise from corruption or heresy, but from its own rigidity. The Badab War was not caused by demons whispering in a Primarch's ears. It was caused by paperwork, suspicion, and an inability to tolerate effective autonomy. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, yet it survives only through decentralization, governors, admirals, chapter masters acting independently across a million worlds, and yet when that independence becomes too effective, it is met with fear rather than trust. Huron crossed a line, but it is worth asking why that line existed at all. The Imperium learned nothing from Badab. It reaffirmed its doctrine: obedience over outcome, compliance over competence. The mechanisms that created Huron were left intact, waiting to produce the next renegade commander who solves problems too efficiently, rules too decisively, and questions authority too openly. In this sense, Huron Blackheart is not an anomaly. He was inevitable. For Huron himself, there is no redemption waiting in the void. The Maelstrom continues to erode what remains of him. Chaos bargains tighter. Control becomes illusion. The distinction he once drew between using the warp and serving it grows thinner with every passing century. But even now, Huron does not see himself as damned. He sees himself as proven right, that the Imperium would rather destroy its own defenders than risk losing control. That loyalty is measured not by success, but by submission, and that survival on the frontier demands choices terror will never make. The Imperium calls Huron Blackheart a monster, but monsters do not emerge from nothing. They are built by fear, by inflexibility, by an empire that cannot trust those it empowers. The Badab War is over. Its lesson was ignored, and somewhere in the Maelstrom, the consequence still endures.